Duke Devlin is known to the world as the creator of Dungeon Dice Monsters, but in the anime he's no slouch of a duelist either, taking down Joey and serving as the driving force in the win against Nesbit with Serena and Tristan. Like his Dungeon Dice strategy, his dueling deck features Orgoth the Relentless as his boss and even recreates elements of Dungeon Dice Monsters with cards like Dice Dungeon and Dimension Dice. Many of his cards have recently been released in the card game, but now it's time to round out this dice deck. To give a quick overview of the Dungeon Dice archetype as it stands, you have two main cards, Dice Dungeon and Dimension Dice. The former searches the latter and also modifies the attack of monsters during the battle phase. The latter can summon out any of dice rolling monsters in your deck or hand. There are a number of dice rolling monsters out there, most notably Snipe Hunter and Dicelops. As for ones that fall into a Duke themed deck, we have Thunderball, and then of course Duke's Ace, Orgoth the Relentless. Some notable extra deck monsters that roll dice include Paradise Smasher, which can lock either player out of monster effects and attacks for a turn, Lucky Straight, which can wipe the board, special summon monsters from the hand or grave, and give you a graceful charity of draw 3, discard 2, and Crazy Box, which has an assortment of effects including drawing, discarding, and destroying cards. As for the spell trap support, in a similar vein, there are a number of cards that roll a dice, but if we're talking about support for dice-related decks, Dice is a noteworthy one as it can search out any dice rolling card from your deck. There is also Summon Dice, which can bring out a monster from your hand or grave. The premise of this deck is to build on the themes of Dungeon Dice Monsters. The existing field spell sets the dungeon and Dimension Dice summons monsters, but there are many other elements of the game that can still be adapted into duel monsters, such as the Crest Pool and the Die Master, among others. The monster lineup will then fittingly consist of monsters used in his Dungeon Dice game with Yugi, as well as monsters Duke uses in his duels. These monsters, like Orgoth and Thunderball that Konami has already released, will function off dice rolls for their effects, and so another aspect of the deck will be to make your die rolls as consistent as Duke's. Starting off the monster lineup is the Dice Master, referred to as the Monster Lord or Die Master in Dungeon Dice. I call it Dice Master to work off cards that have dice in their name. The Die Master in Dungeon Dice represents the player and has 3 life points, or heart points, that the opponent must hit to win the game. As for the card version, this card is a consistency booster by activating in hand when you activate an effect that rolls a die. You then declare a number between 1 and 6, and once that turn when you roll a 6-sided die for an effect, you can treat one of the results as the declared number. This card then allows you to increase the levels of monsters you control by the declared number. So not only will it improve consistency, but it will let you manipulate your monsters' levels for Xyz plays, since there are a couple of worthwhile dice-related Xyz monsters out there, namely Paradise Smasher, Lucky Straight, and Crazy Box. Next is a Duke Retrain Yoranzo Treasure Gambler. Shout out to Leaf Lady on Reddit for the inspiration of this card's effect. You can check out their custom cards of Dungeon Dice Monsters in the description. Yoranzo lets you roll a die and excavate the same number of cards from the top of your deck, then add one that is either a dice card or has a dice rolling effect. Then the remaining cards go to the bottom of your deck. This allows you to search out just about anything in the custom lineup, as well as cards like Dice Dungeon, Dimension Dice, and some others. Next is Swift Strike Ninja, a monster Yugi uses in Dungeon Dice but Duke's Deck Master in Virtual World. He has the quick effect of rolling a die, then banishing that many cards from your grave to banish him until the end phase. Then, if you control the Dungeon Dice field spell, Dice Dungeon, you can banish one monster your opponent controls until the end phase. But while he's banished, he provides you a consistency boost, where once you can change one of the results of your die rolls to any number between 1 and 6. Next is Knight of Twin Swords, who you can special summon from hand if you have activated exactly 2 effects that require you to roll a 6-sided die. And his effect on field lets you roll a 6-sided die twice, and if the results are the same, destroy up to 2 cards in his column. Next is the 7th Grave, a retrain of the 13th Grave, which is a monster Duke swears by for some reason. He can be special summoned from your hand or grave if you have rolled a die for an effect that turn, but banish it when it leaves the field. Of course, that's an effect you can dodge with the various Xyz plays available to you. And when he's summoned, you roll 2 6-sided die, and if the result is less than 7, the total result, then you can change the level of all monsters you control to 5 or 7, allowing you to bring out cards like Paradise Smasher and Lucky Straight. If the total result is more than 7, then you send 1 spell or trap from your deck to the grave. So there are a number of spells and traps that have graveyard effects in this archetype. And then finally, if the total result is 7, then you can use both of these effects in any sequence. And finally, we have Mighty Mage, who has the in-hand effect of being able to roll a die during the main phase, and if the result equals the number of monsters on board, you contribute all of them to special summon this guy from hand. While he's on the field, he provides additional consistency by once per effect, allowing you to re-roll your dice. His first effect combos well with Dice Master because you can chain Dice Master to Mighty Mage, pick whichever number is appropriate with Master, then Mage wipes the board. The spells start off with a die rolling equivalent of Cup of Ace, and that is Dice of Greed. If you roll a 1 or 6, you draw 2 cards, otherwise your opponent draws 2. So this is where some of these effects that allow you to change your roll will come in clutch, turning this into effectively a Pot of Greed. Next is Crest Pool. The Crest Pool in Dungeon Dice is where a player can store attack, guard, magic, trap, and movement crests. So that inspires the effects of this card. Firstly, you can only control 1. Second is that it gains a crest counter each time an effect is activated that rolls a die. Next is the Defense Crest effect, where if a monster you control would be destroyed, you can remove 2 crest counters for each of those monsters instead. And then we have the 3 Ignition effects, where if you remove 1 counter, you get movement by moving 1 monster on the field to an adjacent unoccupied monster zone, which can combo well with cards like Knight of Twin Swords. Removing 2 gets you an attack by destroying 1 monster your opponent controls with less defense than the attack of a monster you have. And removing 4 is your Magic and Trap, allowing you to set 1 dice spell or trap or 1 spell or trap with a dice rolling effect directly from your deck. Next we have Diamond Blade, an equipped spell that can only be equipped to a monster with a die rolling effect, and when it activates that die rolling effect, Diamond Blade lets you pop a card on the field. Diamond Blade can also equip itself from grave to Orgoth the Relentless when you summon him. And for the last spell we have Prepare the Dungeon, where you roll a die then add the appropriate card from your deck, so basically allowing you to grab the pieces that create dungeon dice monsters. 2 lets you nab Dice Dungeon, 3 gets you Crest Pool, 4 gets you Warp Vortex, 5 gets you Dice Master, and a 1 or 6 gets you any 2 of those. Also has a graveyard effect where you can banish it, and then the next time you roll a die, you can change one result to 1 or 6, comboing well with another copy of itself, Dice of Greed, and some other cards out there. The traps start off with the one mentioned on Prepare the Dungeon, and that is Warp Vortex, another reference to the Dungeon Dice game where monsters can teleport throughout the dungeon. This one was a bit tricky to recreate, but here's where I landed. You must control 2 of it to resolve this effect, so you can trigger it with just 1 on board, then reveal the other in the chain. And it is triggered when a monster is placed in this card's column, where you roll a 6-sided die and apply the result as follows. 1 or 2, destroy all spells and traps in columns with Warp Vortex, including themselves. 3 or 4, banish 1 monster in the column of another Warp Vortex. 5 or 6, banish the monster that was placed in the column of that Warp Vortex. And finally, we have Dice Die! A continuous trap that triggers in 2 ways. First, if an activated effect rolls 1 die, immediately after it resolves, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the result times 200. Second, if an activated effect rolls 2 or more die and at least 2 of the results are the same, immediately after that effect resolves, pop a card your opponent controls, and then it has a grave effect where if an effect is activated that rolls a 6-sided die 2 or more times, you can banish it, then treat all the results as 1 and or 6, allowing you to get the most out of cards like Orgoth and Lucky Straight. Alright, now to go through some go-to combos with the Dungeon Dice deck. The deck has a number of ways to manipulate what your dice rolls will be, and Swift Strike Ninja is one of those ways. When he's banished by his effect, anytime we roll a 6-sided die for an effect once per turn while he is banished by his effect, we can change one of the results to a number of our choice from 1 to 6. So we activate a card like Prepare the Dungeon. Like I said, there are a lot of effects where we either want to get a 1 or 6 or want to avoid a 1 or 6. In this case, we want to get a 1 or 6, and that'll allow us to pick any of the 2 cards to search out with Prepare the Dungeon. So that nets us a +1 right there. We get Dice Dungeon and Crest Pool. Activating Dice Dungeon nabs us Dimension Dice, so another plus. And Crest Pool will plus us all day because the more times we roll a dice, the more crest counters it gets, allowing us to activate these various effects that it has, whether that be destroying cards, moving cards around, or searching out spells and traps. Prepare the Dungeon works very well with Dice of Greed because it has a graveyard effect where we can banish it, and the next time we roll a dice, we can change that result to 1 or 6. So we activate Dice of Greed, we roll a dice. Doesn't matter what we get, we're going to get a counter on Crest Pool. We got a 5, our opponent would be drawing 2, but thanks to Prepare the Dungeon's graveyard effect, we will instead change the result to 1 or 6 and draw 2. So those are some nice openings with the deck. Again, very easy ways to generate pluses with cards like Prepare the Dungeon, Dice of Greed, Crest Pool, and Dice Dungeon. This next combo I mentioned in the showcase where we can combine Mighty Mage and Dice Master. So say our opponent has 5 monsters on board, we can activate Mighty Mage in our hand, and this would allow us to roll a 6-sided die, and if the result equals the number of monsters on the field, tribute as many of them as possible and special summon this guy from our hand. So we can take a chance and maybe we'll get a 5, but if we have Dice Master alongside it, we can chain him to Mighty Mage, and now we can declare a number between 1 and 6, and once when we roll a 6-sided die, we can treat one of the results as the declared number. So he'll special summon himself. Our opponent has 5 monsters, and Dice Master adds 1 more to the deal, so that's 6. We'll declare 6. So now that when we resolve Mighty Mage's effect, it'll automatically turn to 6, tributing all 6 monsters on the board to get rid of our opponent's field and bring out Mighty Mage. Next combo we have here is Dimension Dice to bring out Orgoth the Relentless, our boss monster. So using Dimension Dice, we can tribute a monster to bring out a dice rolling monster. And since we special summon Orgoth, we can equip Diamond Blade from the grave to it. And now when we activate the equipped monster's effect that rolls a dice, we can destroy a card with Diamond Blade, and we'll also get Orgoth's effects. And again, there are other cards that make it more consistent and allow you to access whichever one of the effects or all 3 effects that you need to modify the rolls of your Orgoth. And finally, we have the 7th Grave combo. So the 7th Grave can be summoned anytime during a turn where we have rolled a 6-sided die for an effect, such as with the Yaranzo Treasure Gambler. So we'll special summon him. And when we do, we can roll a dice twice, and depending on the sum of the result, we get those appropriate effects. So 1 and a 6. Perfect. So since the exact roll is 7, we get to use both of these effects. Change the level of all monsters we control to 5 or 7. I'm going to pick 5. And then send 1 spell or trap from the deck to the grave. So I'm going to send one of these effects that have a graveyard, cards that have a graveyard effect, die, dice, die. So now that they're both level 5, we're going to go into Paradise Smasher. Use Paradise Smasher's effect to attach both materials. Both players are going to roll 2 6-sided dies, and I'm going to chain on top of that die, dice, die, so that when an effect is activated that rolls a 6-sided die 2 or more times, such as Paradise Smasher, you can banish this card from the grave, treat all of your results as 1 and or 6. So I'm going to treat both of my results as 1, giving me a total of 2. So as long as my opponent rolls a sum of more than 2, say they get a 4 and a 4, they got 8, that means that the player with a higher total cannot activate monster effects or declare an attack until the end of the next turn. So I'm locking my opponent out of monster effects and attacks until my next turn. So those are some go-to combos with the Dungeon Dice deck. So that does it for the Dungeon Dice custom support. Hope you enjoyed. And hey, quick question. When you were a kid, did you prefer playing with fire or with toy soldiers? Be sure to like and subscribe for next week as we combine the best of both worlds.